The United States is not very internationalized. But not very is not the same as not. The Americans do have and will continue to have foreign relations both friendly and unfriendly. With one country, those relations have been so friendly for so long that they have largely been lost in the noise of American domestic politics. Canada has many of the same features that make the United States such a rich and successful country. They're just not arranged right. Yes, the Great Lakes are in effect a series of massive waterways. The St. Lawrence River is world class. The natural harbors at Halifax and Vancouver are among the world's best. The Canadian prairies are remarkably productive. But none of these things are naturally linked together in the way that the United States' geographic blessings overlap. Canada is full of natural boons, yes, but its geographic blessings are scattered about, fracturing the country's economic, cultural, linguistic, and political systems. Daunting physical barriers break Canada into pieces, working from west to east. The first of those barriers is the Rocky Mountains. These peaks are as rugged as their American counterparts, but sufficiently far north that winter closings are common and lacking the broad open spaces of the American Rockies that might host sizable populations. The second major internal Canadian barrier is the Canadian Shield, a creation of the many ice ages that advanced and retreated across what is now Canadian territory. When the glaciers slid southward during the waxing ice ages, they scraped the soil from the bedrock, pushing it ahead of them and depositing most of it in what is now the northern United States. Canada's shorter summers and colder winters greatly retard the process of soil formation. So now, 10 millennia later, the soils are still very thin, shallow, of low fertility, and can only support conifer forests. Clearing the region generates few improvements, as the glacial weight also cracked apart the bedrock, heavily peppering the land with rock uplifts and hundreds of thousands of small lakes. The land is wholly unsuitable for agriculture and extremely difficult to build even nominal transport corridors through. The third barrier is, somewhat ironically, a waterway. After passing by Quebec City, the St. Lawrence River in essence becomes an ever-widening bay. While this allows oceanic traffic easy access to Quebec City, it hives off eastern Canada from the mainland. These three barriers split Canada into 5 largely autonomous pieces. For all practical purposes, Vancouver is a city-state perched at the westernmost edge of Western civilization. It trades more with East Asia and the American West Coast than it does with the core Canadian population centers of Toronto and Montreal. Despite being in the geographic middle of the country, the prairie provinces are in many ways just as isolated. The Rockies sharply curtailed contact to the west, and the Canadian Shield contact to the east. Even today, there is but a single transport corridor that snakes through the 1,200 miles of Canadian Shield between Ontario and Manitoba. As such, Canadian Railways has been forced to invest aggressively into the American railway system in order to ship the agricultural surpluses from the prairie provinces to market, largely via the Mississippi and New Orleans. Similarly, most Albertan energy is exported south to the United States rather than west over or around the Rockies to the Pacific coast or across the trackless shield to the Ontarian core. The cost of crossing the shield is so high that very soon U.S. shale will displace Albertan natural gas as Ontario's fuel of choice. And the shield isn't done. It also hives off Ontario from Quebec. There is only one multi-lane road connecting the two, the 401, which follows the shore of Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River for nearly its entire length. The shield reaches down all the way to the lake and the river in several places, and dominates the northern suburbs of Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa, and Quebec City, complicating significant northward urban expansion. In fact, only Toronto is sufficiently free from the shield in other directions that it can expand in any meaningful way, mostly to the southwest along Lake Ontario. One result is that Ontarian and Quebecois cities sport some of the most expensive real estate in North America, despite being in a climate that is far from balmy. Another is that despite being surrounded by Anglophone Canada, the Quebecois of Quebec have so few practical connections to their neighbors that they have fairly easily been able to maintain their Francophone status. East of Francophone Canada lie the Maritime provinces, which are, well, maritime, and not linked into the rest of the country much at all. From the bridge crossing at Quebec City, A single road stinks across 200 miles of the southern extension of the Canadian Shield south of the river to the New Brunswick border. It's another 450 miles of similarly empty terrain before one finally reaches the container port of St. John's, New Brunswick, on the Atlantic coast. Geographically, Canada just isn't a unified entity. And that's without even considering its more publicly discussed challenges such as the Anglophone-Francophone divide or the country's confederal political system. Or that because of the cold climate, most of the Canadian landmass is simply too inhospitable to support a large population, condemning everyone to live on the country's extreme southern fringe. An oft-asked question in the United States, laced with no small amount of amused derision, is why does Canada even exist? I hate to say it, but it isn't a stupid question. Canada is unstable and unwieldy from a geographic and political point of view, and a series of barely connected American satellites from an economic one. The answer is because the early Canadians, when they were still British subjects, realized their position and worked assiduously to get the Americans to see them as friends rather than British stooges. This was not a simple task. A large portion of Canadian citizens in 1800 were either of French descent or loyalist transplants from the former American colonies who held no love for their former associates. In the War of 1812, the Canadians of American extraction were able to vent something fierce. The British used Canadian territories as their main staging ground for battering the Americans, and provided transport for Canadian Marines in the infamous raid on Washington, D.C. that burned the capital to the ground. And then, much to the Canadians' horror, rather than drive a stake into America's heart, the British redirected their energies to reshaping Europe in the aftermath of Napoleon's fall, leaving Canada to stand alone against the seething Americans. The Canadians, still British colonials, had an unsavory choice. They could do nothing and hope against hope that the still mobilized Americans, who in the absence of the British fleet now held local naval superiority, would forget the enthusiastic role the Canadians had played in the war and leave them be. Or they could offer to negotiate terms. The Canadians wisely chose the latter. In the short term, this deflected American national energies west into the Ohio River Valley and beyond, putting the Americans on the road to superpowerhood. In the long run, it started the process of Canada loosening the ties that bound it to the British Empire, putting it on the road first to neutrality, then friendship with the Americans, then alliance with the Americans, and finally, in the contemporary period, de facto economic inclusion into the American system. Canadian demography, slouching towards dissolution. The Canadian demographic picture is only typical in that it is very similar to that of the rest of the developed world. At some point around 19